1979, an old widow was preparing to go to bed when she heard the sound of a door creaking open downstairs. Assuming it was her daughter who had a spare key, she walked toward the noise without hesitation. As she reached the kitchen, she was confronted by two middle-aged men standing in her living room. One of the men stepped forward, forcing her to keep quiet, while the other demanded to know where she kept her valuables. The widow calmly told them she had nothing of value, and after an exhaustive search, they confirmed her claim. Frustrated, the men sat at the kitchen table trying to plan their next move. It was then that she noticed their desperate expressions and asked what their intentions were. After a brief hesitation, they admitted they were in trouble and needed enough money to catch a bus out of town. Feeling sympathetic, she decided to help them out. The next day, two police officers knocked on her door, asking if she had seen two men who had escaped from prison. Without hesitation, she lied, fully realizing the implications of her actions. After the officers left, she tried to push the incident out of her mind and forget about it. However, a few months later, an unmarked envelope appeared in her mailbox. Inside, she found a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you," along with a stack of cash.
This man pictured here, John Jones, got stuck in a cave and died upside down. In 2009, during a Thanksgiving family outing to Nutty Putty Cave in Utah, John Jones got stuck upside down. This cave was so narrow, it was 10 inches wide and 18 inches tall. Once the family realized John Jones was upside down and stuck, they called a rescue team, and for 27 hours, they tried hard to get him out of there. For context on the situation, this is an illustration of how John Jones was stuck in that cave. At that angle and those dimensions, it is nearly impossible to backtrack your way out of the cave. They ended up putting an injection drip through his leg to calm him down, but after 27 to 28 hours, his heart failed. He also died from suffocation. His family and the landowner agreed to seal the cave shut so that nobody can suffer the same fate as John did. This cave became his tomb. This is another good reason that I would never go cave diving. If I have to crawl into a small space, count me out. This is a very unfortunate story though. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. And would you guys go cave diving?
2 years after her son's disappearance, she hears someone ring the doorbell. What she is about to discover shocked the entire world. Clara is the mother of Jonas, a 7-year-old boy. She had been living alone with her son since Jonas's father abandoned them at the child's birth. Jonas was a happy child who loved playing superhero, but that was before tragedy struck during a school trip to the forest. Jonas got lost, and despite everyone's efforts to find him, the search was unsuccessful. Clara was informed that her son had disappeared. The search lasted several days, but unfortunately the boy was not found. Clara was devastated. She had lost her son and was alone in a house where everything reminded her of Jonas. 2 years later, despite the police investigation, little Jonas was still missing. Clara tried to move on with her life. She knew she would never see her son again. Even so, she tried to stay strong and kept moving forward. However, one day, someone rang the doorbell. What she discovered upon opening the door shocked the entire world. Want to find out what happened? Press the More button and comment Jonas for part 2.
Creepy last words people said right before dying. Laura says that she works in a palliative unit, and many dying patients claim to see nuns. The nuns are said to be dressed in all white or all black. She said that many patients' last words before they died were related to the nuns. She said that one time a patient told her, "Will you tell the nun to stop waking me up at night? She kept waking me up to see if I was okay." On another occasion, she asked a patient who he was talking to, and he replied, "The nun sitting over there." One night, Laura was sitting down, and she noticed someone dressed in all black go into a patient's room. She found it odd for a visitor to come in at 2 a.m., especially since the patient never had visitors before. She decided to peek in the room to see who the visitor was, but when she walked in, there was no one there. The patient passed later that night, even though Laura says that when she put him to bed that night, he didn't seem close to death at all. Laura says that it freaks her out when the patients talk about the nuns.
This 10-year-old girl saved 2 lives but lost her own. Kira Larson was just 10 years old, living in a quiet California neighborhood. She was spirited, protective, and full of love for her family and friends. And that love would soon be tested in the most unimaginable way. On February 22nd, 2016, Kira was watching 2 younger children ages 1 and 2 playing nearby. Everything seemed peaceful until it wasn't. A parked SUV began speeding towards the unsuspecting toddlers. Time seemed to freeze as the vehicle gained speed and headed straight for the children. In that moment, Kira didn't hesitate. Without a second thought for her own safety, she sprinted towards the children, pushing them out of harm's way. But Kira wasn't fast enough to save herself. The SUV struck her with brutal force, pinning her underneath. The laughter of the kids playing was replaced by panicked screams as neighbors rushed to the scene. Kira was then taken to the hospital, but the injuries were way too severe. The brave little girl who had just saved 2 lives didn't survive. Her community was left shattered, but filled with awe at her heroism. Kira was recognized as a true hero, her sacrifice an act of love and courage few could fathom.
I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Lacey Fletcher case. Her parents literally left her to rot in the couch, emaciated. She was in her own feces, her own urine, everything. Her body was literally melting into this couch and fusing with it. And this was like this for 12 years. The trial has concluded and they pled no contest, so they will face 40 years in prison. Now, what bothers me and a lot of other people about this case is people defending them. One person said they loved their daughter to a fault. Does this look like they loved their daughter to a fault to you? Use your eyes and brain. They could have cleaned their daughter, helped her with her needs, fed her properly, but instead they did none of that. She had really bad anxiety in 2010, so they took her to a psychiatrist for anxiety. They wanted to follow up with her, and the parents never came to the follow-up. They couldn't even do something simple like following up with a doctor for their own child's benefit. Honestly, for a crime like this, 40 years is too little. They should have gotten life in prison. At their age, 40 years is probably life in prison, technically, but they should have just gotten slapped with life in prison. Let me know your thoughts on this case.
Imagine getting arrested for having a child with a dead body. Jennifer Burrows is a 26-year-old who was working at a morgue when she was arrested after a DNA test proved her child's father was a dead body she was supposed to autopsy. But it actually gets worse from here, because while Jennifer was working as an assistant pathologist at the morgue, she had relations with more than 60 bodies, belonging to men aged 17 to 71 years old. She did this for 2 years until it led to the birth of her son. Her son's father was a 57-year-old veterinarian from Texas, who passed away in a car accident in 2017. Jennifer was charged with 158 counts of indecent treatment of a corpse. Many psychologists and experts have debated why someone would do this. The reasons range from curiosity to severe mental illness. Some even believe Jennifer was suffering from psychosis. Alright, after all that, I don't really know how to end this video, so stay safe out there and follow for more.
Okay. I don't think I got all of this. Your light flashing on that. I don't know.
On December 22nd, 1990, Beth Potts, her daughter KT, and her husband Rolf returned back to their family cabin. They had been out running some last-minute Christmas errands, but when they entered the home, they found something shocking. Inside of the house was Vaughn Lester Taylor and Edward Stephen Deli. The family had returned to their cabin pictured above and walked in the middle of those two men robbing their house. And that's what the footage from the beginning of this video was. That was real handycam footage captured by the robbers and future murderers, opening up the family's presents moments before the family returned home. Sadly, the robbers would then shoot and kill both Beth and her daughter Kay, and they also forced Rolf, the husband, to undress. They shot him in the head and doused him in gasoline. And afterwards, they kidnapped the family's 2 daughters, Trisha and Lene, who were 16 and 20 years old at the time. The 2 robbers then tried to escape the scene on stolen snowmobiles with the kidnapped girls, but shockingly, Rolf, the father, even though he had been doused in gasoline and shot in the head, was still alive. And he chased the 2 men down the road before they ultimately crashed into the snow and were then captured by authorities. To this day, Vaughn Lester Taylor claims that he was innocent. He says that he aided in the robbery, but he didn't actually do any of the killing. And he's petitioned for parole many times and just might get out one day, which is a horrifying thought.
This brother and sister are the youngest children to be convicted for first-degree murder in the United States. The story of Catherine and Curtis Jones is very controversial and heartbreaking all around. Catherine is the older sister, and her brother Curtis was born only a year later. Their father was very abusive towards their mother. It was very violent, very terrible. When their mother was pregnant with Catherine, their father's abuse was so bad it actually led to their mother's uterus tearing, and Catherine having to be born prematurely. When Catherine and Curtis were only toddlers, their mom left their father, so she was luckily able to flee her abuser, but she had to abandon her 2 children in the process, so she left them with this abusive man. And afterwards, a male relative of their father moved in with them, and this relative began to essay 5-year-old Catherine nearly every day for years. When she tried to tell her father of the abuse, he said he didn't believe her, but her younger brother Curtis told Catherine that he believed her because he was also being abused by this relative. Over the next handful of years, CPS would be called at least 3 times to investigate the accusations that the Jones siblings were being physically abused as well as being essayed, and every single time their father pretty much defended his relative and claimed that his 2 children were liars. Even after the CPS agents uncovered that this unnamed male relative had a history of essaying children, he was a registered essay offender and previously was even accused of essaying his girlfriend's daughter when he was living with her, the father still would defend him, and every single time the CPS investigations were dropped. The system that is meant to protect children has failed Catherine and Curtis time and time again, and their own father and mother have failed them as well. By 1999, 3 adults were living with the Jones siblings, their monster relative, their father, and their father's 29-year-old girlfriend named Sonia Spites, who allegedly also saw the abuse but did nothing. In 1999, Catherine was 13 years old and Curtis was 12 years old, and they've been abused by their relative since they were 4 and 5 years old. They were at their breaking point. Catherine told her younger brother that she wanted to kill all the adults that were hurting them and letting this abuse to go on, as well as, of course, kill their abuser. And for whatever reason, they decided to go after their father's girlfriend first. On January 6, 1999, 13-year-old Catherine and 12-year-old Curtis went and grabbed their father's weapon, while their father's girlfriend Sonia sat and did a puzzle at the kitchen table. They both opened fire on her, and at one point Sonia actually tried to get up and grab the phone for help, but Catherine took it away from her. And once their father's girlfriend was dead, both the children began to panic because now this was real. Catherine tried to clean both their fingerprints off of the weapon, and then she called 911 to report that there was an accident, and then both children fled the home. Catherine and Curtis were caught and arrested early the next morning, and they were arrested on charges of first-degree murder, and they were going to be tried as adults, making them the youngest children to be tried as adults for first-degree murder in the United States. Once they were arrested, both siblings tried to take full responsibility and claimed that the other one had no involvement. They were trying to protect each other. 13-year-old Catherine was even offered a plea deal to testify against her younger brother, but she refused. Ultimately, both Catherine and Curtis were sentenced to 18 years in an adult prison. And then after their release, they would be on probation for the rest of their lives. And they're 12 and 13 years old and going to adult prison. Both of them said that they felt safer in prison than back home with their abuser. Due to Catherine's young age, the adult female prison that she was being sent to was worried about her safety, so they forced Catherine, at 13 years old, to spend the first 3 years of her sentence in solitary confinement, which is seen as like torture to full-grown, fully formed adults. And that's how she spent 13 to 16 years old, completely alone in dark, solitary confinement. And public opinion on the Jones siblings were completely split. There were people in 1999 that saw these children as cold-blooded monsters, and then there were other people that saw them as traumatized children that the system completely failed. And that it was very unfair that these children were being tried and sentenced as adults, having to spend their sentences in adult prison. And there's a lot of people that believe that it possibly would have gone a little bit different if they had been white. In 2016, Catherine was released from prison at age 30. She is now married, she's a mom herself, and she's a huge advocate and voice for victims and for fair sentencing for juvenile offenders. And her younger brother, Curtis, was released the following year, also at age 30, and he is now an ordained minister. So it seems like both of them have been rehabilitated and are trying to live better lives. We've talked about child killers before, and it's always an interesting conversation in the comments about if you think child killers can be rehabilitated. Do you think that juveniles should ever be tried and sentenced as adults, or is it a case-by-case basis? Let me know all your thoughts on this in the comments. Let me know what case you want to see me cover next, and I will see you guys next time.
The person behind me is the youngest woman ever to be sentenced to death in the United States. She was only 18 years old when she committed the crime and 20 years old when she was sentenced. This is the story of Krista Pike. Reminder, I tell a lot of dark true crime stories on this channel. Severe discretion is advised, but follow along if you want to hear more. So this is Krista Pike, and she had a terrible childhood. She was born in West Virginia in 1976. Her parents divorced when she was really young, and her childhood was marred by dysfunction and neglect. Her mother's name was Carissa Hansen, and she sucked ass. She often prioritized romantic relationships over parenting, and it left Krista feeling abandoned and unloved. Both of her parents were incredibly negligent. One of her aunts even noted that they found her as a baby crawling through dog droppings all over the house. She bounced around a lot in different foster homes because she was apparently violent towards other children, so she couldn't find a permanent house. And by the time she reached her teenage years, she had made several attempts on her life, and she turned to substances in order to cope. She dropped out of high school her junior year, and with little support and direction, she joined the Job Corps in Nashville, Tennessee as a fresh start. But tale as old as time, she instead became infatuated with a boy, and this is where the story takes an even darker turn. So Krista Pike became absolutely smitten with Daryl Shipp, who was 17 at the time, and he had his own troubled past. But together they bonded over a shared interest in the occult and dark practices. So it's important to recognize that Krista's history with abandonment, lack of guidance, and exposure to toxic relationships as a kid played a big role in shaping her psyche. And she really felt like this boy made her complete. But then another girl comes into the picture and threatens everything. This is 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer. She was in the same job training program as Krista and Daryl. And Krista had totally convinced herself that Colleen was trying to steal her boyfriend. Whether there is any truth to this still remains unclear, but what we do know is that Krista's jealousy spiraled into a violent obsession, and she started like a really insidious plot. On the night of January 12th, 1995, Krista lured Colleen into a wooded area near the Job Corps campus. She brought along her boyfriend Daryl Shipp and an accomplice, Shadola Peterson. They told Colleen that they were just going to go into the woods and party, but then Krista and her boyfriend attacked her. Colleen was beaten, taunted, slashed, and tortured for 30 minutes. They both carved pentagrams into her chest, and then the final blow came when Krista took a piece of asphalt and smashed it into Colleen's skull, which ended her life. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Krista decided she wanted a souvenir from the crime, so she decided to take a piece of Colleen's skull. They were caught within 36 hours, for a number of reasons. For one, the brutality of the crime left a mountain of evidence that pointed them straight to these three, and Colleen, with her 18-year-old hubris, decided to go around and brag about the crime to her friends, and even showing off Colleen's skull to people. So the evidence was overwhelming, and there was no question that they did it. It was just what was going to happen to them now. Krista was tried in 1996, and she didn't show much remorse. The jury only took 2.5 hours to find her guilty of first-degree murder. Krista's defense argued that she was only 18 at the time of the crime, and that her troubled upbringing should influence her sentencing. But they decided to sentence Krista Pike to death. Daryl Shipp, her boyfriend, was 17 at the time of the crime, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no parole. And their accomplice, Shadola Peterson, was given probation in exchange for her testimony. Krista Pike remains on death row to this day, despite her many attempts to apply for appeals, which have all been denied. And in that time, she has not been a model prisoner. She has been violent with other inmates, and she even plotted a prison escape with her boyfriend and a prison guard, unsuccessfully. So while Krista's upbringing offers us a glimpse into her mindset as a person looking for belonging in all the wrong places, it doesn't excuse her behavior or the decisions that she made that night, because Colleen Slemmer's family still lives with the pain of her loss. And that is the story of Krista Pike, the youngest woman to ever be sentenced to death.
When this teenager went missing, police would uncover some disturbing information about somebody extremely close to her. It was May 2006 in Omaha in Nebraska. Jessica Jo O'Grady was just 19 years old and had her whole life ahead of her. She was living with her 2 friends in an apartment, and Jessica was a really liked girl by all accounts. She was bubbly and had no problem making friends. She was confident and intelligent. She actually was attending university and wanted to become a teacher. She had a boyfriend who was the same age as her. This was Chris Edwards, and they seemed like a really normal couple who would hang out not only just on their own but also with Jessica's other friends. On the 10th of the month, Jessica was at her apartment with her friends when she got a text off Chris. It didn't seem to her friends that anything was wrong. This was quite normal for Jessica to speak to Chris and then sometimes pop over to his, so she told her friends that she was going over there for the evening. At this point, it was just after 11 p.m. Horrifically, they would never see her alive again. About half an hour later, her friends got a text off Jessica that was a little bit cryptic. It said, "No more shenanigans for Jessica," and this was kind of like a code word that Jessica and her friends used for getting intimate. It wasn't totally clear what the text meant, but the girls figured that they'd see her in the morning and they'd all catch up. However, the next day, there was no sign of Jessica at all. She just never came home. The friends tried to contact her but had no luck, and they also contacted Jessica's family, but they'd not heard of her either. They then questioned Chris and said, what time did she leave yours? And Chris dropped the bombshell that she'd never been there in the first place. This was obviously very disturbing, as the girls were like, well, where did she go then? Worryingly, some other girls had vanished in the area recently too. A girl called Amber Harris had gone missing from a bus stop, and 35-year-old Tracy Tribble had also been reported missing. Locals started to worry that maybe she was the victim of a serial killer. So was this a coincidence? Well, it turns out that it just was a coincidence, and if you want me to cover the other cases, please let me know in the comments. Days later, a local person contacted police to say that they'd found an abandoned car, and this was Jessica's car. Police then obviously decided to question the boyfriend. This was the obvious kind of suspect to look at. He said that he'd been golfing earlier on in the day, which his friends confirmed. He then said that they'd been to watch a film, and again, the friends confirmed that he had. Something strange did come up in the interview though. Chris kind of just randomly offered the information that he thought Jessica was depressed because she was pregnant. Chris also offered the information that he didn't think that the baby was his. Now, this obviously completely changed the course of the investigation. We know that one of the leading causes of death of pregnant women is homicide. Again, police spoke with Chris's friends, but although they said that he'd been with them for the golf and the film, they didn't know what he did after going for the film. Investigators then did some digging into Chris's personal life and found out Jessica wasn't the only woman in his life. He was also seeing a girl called Michelle, and then there was another bombshell. Just 4 months before Jessica's disappearance, Michelle found out she was pregnant with Chris's child. Chris had got Michelle pregnant and they'd agreed to get married. So basically, this Chris had got 2 women pregnant in a very short period of time. This was not looking good. He definitely had a motive for killing her. Officers searched Chris's house and found blood, and not just a little bit, not just like a cut from a finger. This was a lot of blood. There was an absolutely huge blood stain, and you can see it on Google if you look, on the mattress that had conveniently been flipped over in Chris's bedroom. There was also blood in Chris's car and on a weapon that he had in his house. CCTV also showed that the day after Jessica vanished, Chris went shopping for white paint. Forensics managed to match the blood to missing Jessica, but they still hadn't found her body. Despite this, Chris was taken to trial where he was found guilty of Jessica's murder. He was given life in prison, and Jessica's body remains to be found.